We'll talk about methods of alternative assessments for ELL and ESL students. There are a lot of challenges that come when testing a student for whom English is not their first language. There is only one way that it is acceptable and allowed to test a child in English if English is not their first language, and there must be extensive documentation of their proficiency in social and academic language in English. It needs to be documented extensively and from multiple sources that the student is able to understand English in a way that will allow them to take the test sufficiently. One of the challenges is the difference between social language and academic language. Social language is the language of conversation, just talking with their friends on the playground or being able to talk to people at the grocery store. That all falls under social language. Academic language is the language used in classrooms and in testing, and that language can sometimes take longer to gain proficiency in. And proficiency in English in and of itself is another challenge when testing students that are learning English as a second language. If we test a student in English and we haven't documented that they're proficient in English, we can't be sure if we're assessing their target skills or their access skills. Target skills are the skills that an assessment is supposed to measure, so math skills, writing skills, reading skills. If a child doesn't know English and isn't proficient in English, then we're testing their access skills, the skills that they have to be able to access and understand the information. There are also a lot of factors that impact their acquisition of the English language, how long they have been here, whether or not English is spoken at home, how immersed they are in English, how old they are. All of these factors impact their ability to learn and be proficient in English. And so there are alternative ways to test students for whom English is not their first language that don't involve testing them in English. And it's sometimes called the FIST list because there's 5 things arranged from the best to the least effective ways in order to test a student who is learning English as a second language. The first is to assess them in their native language, then seek outside assistance, then refer to another person, then perform nonverbal assessment, and finally perform authentic assessment. So the best option is to assess them in their native language. Whenever possible, assessing a child in their native language is the ideal because that is the language they're most fluent in and they will understand the most. But we need to be sure that we use an assessment that was commercially published in their native language, not one that was translated after publication, because that will change the meaning and the interpretation of the test itself. For example, the Woodcock Johnson is available in Spanish as well as in English, and it was originally published in both languages at the same time, so that is acceptable to use. If that's not possible, then you should seek outside help or an expert consultation. This expert will come to you and advise you on how best to assess this child or what assessments to give them. You will ultimately still be responsible for assessing them. You will still be in charge, but you will have someone who understands that child's language and culture come and help you. If that's not an option, then you must refer the child to someone else to be tested. Someone outside of you or your school district, someone who will be able to assess the child fairly and accurately. If that's still not an option, then you use nonverbal normed assessments. There are assessments that don't require you to speak to the child that you are assessing. Some forms of IQ test have children recreate patterns using colored shapes or solve problems without speaking. That way you can still assess the child's educational development without assessing their language skills. And the final option, which is only a last resort, is to use authentic assessments to see how the child performs in their typical environment. These would include observations of the child in the classroom or the playground or wherever they typically are, samples of their work from the teacher, portfolios, or even interviews with the teacher if necessary. As I said before, this is the least reliable option and should only be used as a last resort. So the first option is really your first option, and they go down in degree of effectiveness as you get down to number 5. So You can review this video or talk with a classmate or talk with a tutor if you still need help remembering the alternative methods for assessing a child learning English as a second language. Bye!